1. Past the flannel plains and blacktop graphs and skylines of canted rust, and past the tobacco-brown river overhung with weeping trees and coins of sunlight through them on the water downriver, to the place beyond the windbreak, where untilled fields simmer shrilly in the AM heat. Shattercane, lamb's quarter, cutgrass, sawbriar, nutgrass, Jimson weed, wild mint, dandelion, foxtail, muscadine, spine cabbage, goldenrod, creeping Charlie, butterprint, nightshade, ragweed, wild oat, vetch, butchergrass, invaginate volunteer beans, all heads gently nodding in a morning breeze like a mother's soft hand on your cheek. An arrow of starlings fired from the windbreak's thatch, the glitter of dew that stays where it is and steams all day. A sunflower, 4 more, one bowed, and horses in the distance standing rigid and still as toys. All nodding. Electric sounds of insects at their business. Ale-colored sunshine and pale sky and whirls of cirrus so high they cast no shadow. Insects all business all the time. Quartz and chert and schist and chondrite iron scabs in granite. Very old land. Look around you. The horizon trembling, shapeless. We are all of us brothers. Some crows came overhead then, 3 or 4, not to murder, on the wing, silent with intent, corn-bound for the pasture's wire, beyond which one horse smells at the others behind, the lead horse's tail obligingly lifted. Your shoes brand incised in the dew, an alfalfa breeze, socks burrs, dry scratching inside a culvert, rusted wire and tilted posts, more a symbol of restraint than a fence per se. No hunting. The shush of the interstate off past the windbreak, the pasture's crows standing at angles, turning up patties to get at the worms underneath. The shapes of the worms incised in the overturned dung and baked by the sun all day until hardened, there to stay. Tiny vacant lines in rows, and inset curls that do not close because head never quite touches tail. Read these. 2. From Midway, Claude Sylvanshine then flew on something called Consolidated Thrust Regional Lines down to Peoria, a terrifying 30-seater whose pilot had pimples at the back of his neck, and reached back to pull a dingy fabric curtain over the cockpit, and the beverage service consisted of a staggering girl underhanding you nuts while you chugged a Pepsi. Sylvanshine's window seat was in 8-something, an emergency row, beside an older lady with a sack-like chin who could not seem, despite strenuous efforts, to open her nuts. The core accounting equation, A equals L plus E, can be dissolved and reshuffled into everything from E equals A minus L to beyond. The craft rode the updrafts and downdrafts like a dinghy in a gale. The only service in Peoria was regional, out of either St. Louis or the 2 Chicagos. Sylvanshine had an inner ear thing and couldn't read on planes, but did read the emergency laminated card, twice. It was mostly illustrations. For legal reasons, the airline had to presume illiteracy. Without being aware that he was doing so, Sylvanshine mentally repeated the word illiterate several dozen times, until the word ceased to mean anything and became just a rhythmic sound, not unlovely, but out of sync with the propeller's flux's pulse. It was something he did when he was under stress and did not want an incursion. His point of departure was Dulles, after a service shuttle from Shepherdstown, Martinsburg. The three major codifications of U.S. tax law being, of course, 16, 39, and 54, with 81 and 82's indexing and anti-abuse provisions also relevant. The fact that another major recodification was on the horizon would not, obviously, be on the CPA exam. Silvenshine's private goal was to pass the CPA exam, thereby immediately advancing 2 pay grades. The extent of the recodification would, of course, depend in part on the service's success in carrying out the initiative's directives. The job and the exam had to occupy 2 separate parts of his mind. It was crucial that he maintain separation of powers, separation of the 2 areas. Calculating depreciation recapture for Section 1231 assets is a 5-step process. The flight took 50 minutes and seemed much longer. There was nothing to do, and nothing would hold still in his head in all the confined noise, and after the nuts were gone, and there was nothing else for Silvenshine to do to occupy his mind but try to look at the ground, which appeared close enough that he could make out house colors and the types of different vehicles on the pale interstate the plane seemed to tack back and forth across. The cards' figures opening emergency doors and pulling cords and crossing their arms funereally with their seat cushions on their chests seemed amateurishly drawn, and their features little more than bumps. You couldn't see fear or relief or really anything on their faces as they slid down the emergency chutes in the drawing. Emergency doors' handles opened in one way, and emergency hatches over the wings opened in a totally different way. Components of equity include common stock, retained earnings, and how many different types of SE transaction. Distinguish between perpetual and periodic inventory and explain the relations between a physical inventory and the cost of goods sold. The darkly grey head ahead of him gave off a scent of Brill cream that was even now surely soaking and staining the little paper towel on the seat top. Silvenshine wished again that Reynolds was with him on the flight. Silvenshine and Reynolds were both aides to Systems Icon Merrill Errol Mel Lurrell, although Reynolds was a GS-11 and Silvenshine only a miserable and pathetic GS-9. Silvenshine and Reynolds had lived together and gone everywhere together since the Rome RAC debacle in '82. They weren't homosexual, they just lived together and both worked closely with Dr. Lerrell at Systems. Reynolds had both his CPA and a degree in Information Systems Management, although he was only slightly more than 2 years Claude Silvenshine's senior. This asymmetry was just one more thing that compromised Silvenshine's self-regard since Rome, and made him doubly loyal and grateful to Systems Director Lurrell for having salvaged him from the debris of the catastrophe in Rome and believing in his potential once his niche as a cog in the system was found. The double-entry method invented by Italian Pacioli during the same period as C. Columbus Italia. The card indicated that this was the type of aircraft whose emergency oxygen was a fire extinguisher-ish thing beneath the seats, rather than dropping from overhead. The primitive opacity of the figures' faces was actually scarier than fear, or some kind of visible expression would have been. It was unclear whether the card's primary function was legal, or PR, or both. He briefly tried to remember the definition of yaw. Every so often while studying for the exam this winter, Silvenshine would burp, and it would seem like more than a burp. It would taste like he'd almost thrown up a little. A light rain made a moving lace on the window and distended the cross-hatched land they went over. At root, Silvenshine saw himself as a dithering ninny with at most one marginal talent whose connection to him was itself marginal. Here is what occurred at the service's Rome, NY, Northeast Regional Examination Center on or about the date in question. 2 departments had fallen behind and reacted in a regrettably unprofessional fashion. An atmosphere of extreme stress was allowed to cloud judgment and overrule set procedures. The department attempting to hide the growing pile of returns and cross-audit receipts and W-2 1099 copies, rather than duly reporting the backlog and requesting that some of the excess be rerouted to other centers. There failed to be full disclosure and prompt remedial action. Just where the failure and breakdown had occurred was still a matter of controversy, despite blame-storming sessions at the very highest levels of compliance, though ultimately the responsibility lay with the Rome RAC director, despite the fact that it was never quite established whether the department heads had made her fully aware of the extent of the backlog. The dark service joke about this director now had been that her desk had had a Trumanesque wooden plaque on it which read, "What Buck?" It had taken 3 weeks for district audit sections to start howling over the shortfall of examined returns for audit and/or automated collection systems, and the complaints had slowly worked their way up and over into inspections, as anyone should have been able to figure was only a matter of time. The Rome director had taken early retirement, and one group manager had been fired outright, which was exceedingly rare for GS-13s. It was obviously important that remedial action be quiet and that undue publicity not compromise the public's full faith and confidence in the service. No one threw forms away. Hid, yes, but not destroyed or discarded. Even in the midst of disastrous departmental psychosis, no one could bring himself to burn, shred, or pack in hefties and discard. That would have been a real disaster. That would have become public. The emergency hatch's window was nothing more than several layers of plastic, it appeared, the inside of which gave ominously under digital pressure. Over the window was a stern injunction against opening the emergency hatch, accompanied by an iconic triptych explaining how to open just this hatch. As a system, in other words, it was poorly thought through. What was now called stress used to be called tension or pressure. Pressure was now more like something you put on someone else, as in high-pressure salesmen. Reynolds said that one of Dr. Lerrill's interbranch liaisons had described the Peoria RAC as a real pressure cooker, although that was in terms of exams, not personnel, to which latter Silvenschein was posted as advance and ground-laying for a possible systems full out. The truth, which Reynolds had stopped just short of expressing as such, was that the assignment couldn't be that sensitive if they trusted it to Silvenschein. There were, according to his researches, registration slots for the CPA examination at Peoria College of Business on November 7th and 8th, and at Joliet Community College, November 14th to 15th. Duration of this posting unknown. One of the most effective isometric exercises for the desk-bound is to sit up quite straight and tighten the large muscles of the buttocks, holding for a count of 8, then release. It tones, aids blood flow and alertness, and can, unlike other isometric exercises, be performed even in public, being largely obscured by the desk's material mass. Avoid grimacing or loud exhalations upon release. Preferential transfers, liquidation provisions, unsecured creditors, claims against bankruptcy estate as per Chapter 7. He had his hat in his lap, over the belt. Systems Director Lerrill had started as a GS9 auditor in Danville, VA, before the éclat and rapid rise. He had the strength of 10 men. When Silvenschein studied for the exam now, the worst thing was that studying any one thing would set off a storm in his head about all the other things he hadn't studied and felt he was still weak on, making it almost impossible to concentrate, causing him to fall even further behind. He'd been studying for the CPA exam for 3.5 years. It was like trying to build a model in a high wind. The most important component in organizing a structure for effective study is something. What killed him were the story problems. Reynolds had passed the exam on his first sit. Yaw was rotating slightly from side to side. The word for pitching forward and back was something else. Axes were involved. There was something called gimbal that came into his mind whenever he saw the Donegan kid at Lombard High, who then later ended up at Mission Control for the last 2 Apollos and had his picture in a glass case by the office at Lombard. The worst then was that he knew what teachers were the last people suited for their jobs. and they then smelled some part of this knowledge on him, and were at their worst when he was watching. It was a loop. Silvenshine's senior yearbook in his trunk in storage in Philly was almost wholly unsigned. The older party next door was still trying to open her package of nuts with her teeth, but had been clear on not wanting help or needing help. The projected benefit obligation, PBO, equals the present value of all benefits attributed by the pension benefit formula to employee services rendered prior to that date. If you spell it fast with stress on the H and the A, and then the second A and the H again, then headache becomes a lilting children's rhymed refrain, something to jump rope to. Look down your shirt and spell attic. One of the teenagers outside the video arcade next to the facilities at Midway had worn a black t-shirt with the words "Sympathy for Nixon Tour" and then a long list of cities in tiny applique letters. The teen, who was not on the flight, had then sat briefly across from Silvenshine in the gate area and had picked at his face with a concentration that wasn't at all like the absent face-picking and feeling at parts of the face that accompanied concentrated work in the service. Silvenshine still dreamed of desk drawers and air ducts stuffed with forms, and forms' edges protruding from grills over the ducts, and the utility closet stacked to the top with hollerith cards, and the inspections division lady forcing the door and the cards all falling out on her like McGee's closet as the whole debacle caught up to them after they fell behind on cross-audit receipts at the Rome RAC. He dreamed still of Grecula and Harris disabling the Fornix mainframe with something poured from a thermos into the rear vent as hisses and bits of blue-tinged smoke issued. The teen had had no vocational aura at all. This happened with some people. Ethical standards comprising the exam's whole first unit, about which there were also many service jokes. A violation of the profession's ethical standards most likely would have occurred when. Such was the propeller's otherworldly sound that Silvenshine now could hear nothing more than drifting syllables of the exchanges around him. The woman's claw on the steel armrests between them was a horrible sight that he declined to attend to. Old people's hands frightened and repelled him. He'd had grandparents whose hands he could remember in their laps looking alien and claw-like. Upon incorporation, Jones Incorporated issues common stock at a price in excess of its par value. It was difficult not to imagine the faces of those whose jobs were writing these questions. What they thought about, what their professional hopes and dreams were. Many of the questions were like little stories with all the human meat left out. On December 1st, 1982, Clark County leases office space for 3 years at a monthly rental of $20,000. For a cost of $100, Silvenshine tried flexing first one buttock and then the other, instead of both buttocks at once, which required concentration and a strange type of non-control, like trying to wiggle your ears in the mirror. He tried the incline to the side thing of stretching out his neck muscles on each side very gently and gradually, but still got a look from the older lady, who with her dark dress and staved-in face appeared more and more skull-like and frightening, and like some type of omen of death, or crushing failure on the CPA exam, which two things had collapsed in Silvenshine's psyche to a single image of his silently, expressionlessly pushing a wide industrial mop down a corridor lined with frosted glass doors bearing other men's names. Even the sight of a mop, rollable bucket, or custodian with his name woven in red Palmer script on the breast pocket of his grey jumpsuit, as at Midway, outside the men's room whose little yellow sign warned bilingually of wet floors, the cursive name, something beginning with M, Morris or Maurice, the man fitted to his job like a man to the exact pocket of space he displaces, now rattled Silvenshine to the point where precious time was lost before he could even think about how to set up a workable schedule for maximally efficient reviewing for the exam, even mentally, which he did every day. His great weakness was strategic organization and apportionment of time, as Reynolds pointed out at every opportunity. enjoining Claude to, for Christ's sake, just take a book off the stack and study, instead of sitting there noodling impotently about how best to study. Stuffing returns behind cabinets and into air ducts, locking desk drawers so filled with cross-reference forms that they could not open anyhow, hiding things beneath other things in Tingle's baskets. Reynolds had simply appeared at the director's office before the hearing, and the whole personal disaster seemingly vanished in some bureaucratic puff of violet smoke. And a week later, Silvenschein was unpacking his boxes at Systems in Martinsburg under Dr. Lerell. The whole thing felt like being in a near-traffic fatality, avoided by inches, and later not being able even to think of the whole thing lest you begin shaking and be unable to function. It had been such a near disaster. The entire fat spot had melted down. The small sound of a simulated bell accompanied the overhead glyph of seatbelts and cigarettes lighting up or disappearing. Silvenschein looked up every time without consciously intending to. In obtaining evidential matter in support of financial statement assertions, the auditor developed specific audit objectives in light of those assertions. An infant keened in some aisle behind him. Silvenschein imagined the mother simply unbuckling and withdrawing to some other aisle and leaving it there. In filling, after the frenzy surrounding the introduction of inflation indexes that new templates had to be configured for in 81, he had been diagnosed with a stress-related pinched nerve in his neck and upper back, which the enforced unnatural posture of the tiny narrow 8B and the death-like claw on the armrest beside him aggravated if he gave it his attention. It was true. The entire ballgame, in terms of both the exam and life, was what you gave attention to versus what you willed yourself to not. Silvenschein viewed himself as weak or defective in the area of will. Most of what others esteemed or valued in him was unwilled, simply given, like a person's height or facial symmetry. Reynolds called him weak-minded, and it was true. He had a serial memory of their neighbor, Mr. Satterthwaite, filling in scuffs on his postal uniform shoes with a black pen, which then, before he was aware of it, expanded into a whole narrative memory of Mr. and Mrs. Satterthwaite, who were childless and did not, if you first met them, appear all that friendly or interested in children, nevertheless allowing their backyard to become the de facto HQ for all the children in the neighborhood, and even the slapdash and unsound treehouse they had allowed Silvenschein and the Roman Catholic boy with the tic like a chronic wince to try to construct in one of their trees, and Silvenschein could not recall whether it was because the boy's family had moved away that the treehouse was not completed, or whether the move had taken place later and the treehouse had simply been too slapdash and sap-soaked to continue with. Mrs. Satterthwaite had had lupus and was often indisposed. Deviation rates, precision limits, stratified sampling. As Dr. Lerell had explained it, entropy was a measure of a certain type of information that there was no point in knowing. Lerell's axiom was that the definitive test of the efficiency of any organization structure was information, and the filtering and dissemination of information. Real entropy had zippo to do with temperature. Another effective concentration device was to summon into one's mind a soothing and low-pressure outdoor scene, either imagined or from memory, which was even more effective if the scene comprised or included a pond, lake, brook, or stream, as water had been proven to have a calming and centering effect on the involuntary nervous system. But try as he might, after the buttock exercises, Silvenschein could summon only a jagged primary color array that looked like a psychedelic poster or something resembling what you see if you're poked in the eye and then close your eye in pain. The oddness of the word indisposed proved that the relation of long-term bond prices to long-term capital gains tax rates is not inverse. He knew who on the plane was in love, who would say they were in love because it was what you were supposed to say, and who would say they were not in love. Reynolds' own professed take on marriage, family, was that from boyhood on he had never liked fathers and had no wish to be one. In 3 separate venues in today's various airports, Silvenschein had found himself locking eyes with 30-year-old men who had infants in high-tech papoose-like packs on their backs, their wives with quilted infant supply bags at their sides. The wives in charge, the men appearing essentially soft or softened in some way, desperate in a resigned way, their stride not quite a trudge. their eyes empty and over-mild with the weary stoicism of young fathers. Reynolds would call it not stoicism, but acquiescence to some large and terrible truth. The term dependent includes any person who qualifies as a dependency exemption, or would otherwise qualify as a dependency exemption except that the gross income and joint return tests are not met. Name 2 standard devices by which fiduciaries may legally shift tax liability to beneficiaries. The term passive losses was not even on the CPA exam. It was vital to divide service priorities and exam priorities into 2 exclusive modules or networks. One of 4 stated projects was to enhance Peoria 047's ability to distinguish legitimate investment partnerships from tax shelters whose entire purpose was to avoid taxes. The key was identifying passive versus active losses. The actual project was to create both a case and a control structure for the automation of crucial examination functions at the Peoria Center. The goal was to have automation in place by the time revenue rulings against certain passive loss provisions were codified in next year's tax law. The older lady's rouge very red, and a paperback with a bookmark's tongue unopened in her lap. The veinous and piebald claw. Sylvanshine's seat number was right there, stamped onto the brushed steel of the armrest, next to the claw. Its nails were deeply, perfectly red. The smell of his mother's polish remover, of her makeup compact, the way wisps of her hair escaped the bun and curled down the back of her neck in the steam of the kitchen when he and O'Dowd had returned from the Satterthwaite's backyard with hammered thumbs and sap in their lashes. Wisps and flashes of uncolored cloud flashed past the window. Above and below were a different story, but there was always something disappointing about clouds when you were inside them. They ceased to be clouds at all. It just got really foggy. Yaw was way in a mirror. It occurred for no reason. Sylvanshine then spent some time trying to feel the fact that his personal body was traveling at the same speed as the craft he was inside. On a large jet, it felt like merely sitting in a loud, narrow room. Here, at least, the changes in the seats and belt's pressures against him allowed him to be aware of movement, and there seemed to be some security in the physical candor of this, which partly offset the fragility and spatter potential of the sound of the propellers, which Sylvanshine tried to think of what the prop sounded like, but could not except as a gnawingly hypnotic rotary hum, so total that it might have been silence itself. A lobotomy involved some kind of rod or probe inserted through the eye socket. The term was always frontal lobotomy, but was there any other kind? Knowing that internal stress could cause failure on the exam merely set up internal stress about the prospect of internal stress. There must be some other way to deal with the knowledge of the disastrous consequences fear and stress could bring about. Some answer or trick of the will, the ability not to think about it. What if everyone knew this trick but Claude Sylvanshine? He tended to conceptualize some ultimate platonic-level terror as a bird of prey in whose mere aloft shadow the prey was stricken and paralyzed, trembling as the shadow enlarged and became inevitability. He frequently had this feeling. What if there was something essentially wrong with Claude Sylvanshine that wasn't wrong with other people? What if he was simply ill-suited, the way some people are born without limbs or certain organs? The neurology of failure. What if he was simply born and destined to live in the shadow of total fear and despair, and all his so-called activities were pathetic attempts to distract him from the inevitable? Discuss important differences between reserve accounting and charge-off accounting in the tax treatment of bad debts. Surely fear is a type of stress. Tedium is like stress, but its own category of woe. Sylvanshine's father, whenever something professionally bad happened, which was a lot, had a habit of saying, "Woe to Sylvanshine." There is an anti-stress technique called thought stopping. The excess present value index is the ratio of the present value of future cash inflows to the initial investment. Segment, significant segment, combined segment revenue, absolute combined segment revenue, operating profit, material price variance, direct material price variance. He thought of the removable grate over the air duct above his and Ray Harris's desk in the Rome RAC and the sound of the grate being removed and then jammed back into place and driven home with the heel of Harris's hand, and then recoiled from the thought in a way that made it feel as if the craft were accelerating. The interstate highway below disappeared and then sometimes reappeared at a spot Silvenstein had to squash his cheek right up against the plastic inner window to see. Then, as the rain recommenced and he could tell they were beginning descent, it reappeared in the window's center, light traffic crawling with a futile, pointless pathos you could never sense on the ground. What if it felt as slow to actually drive as it looked from this perspective? It would be like trying to run underwater. The whole ballgame was perspective, filtering, the choice of perception's objects. Silvenstein tried to envision the small plane as seen from the ground, a cruciform shape against the old bathwater color of the cloud cover, its lights blinking complexly in the rain. He imagined rain on his face. It was light, a West Virginia rain. He hadn't heard one unit of thunder. Silvenstein had once been on a first date with a Xerox rep who had complex and slightly repulsive patterns of callus on her fingers from playing the banjo semi-professionally as her off-time passion. And he remembered, as the overhead bell again rang and the sign lit, the no-cigarette glyph legally redundant, the pad's calluses deep yellow in the low dinner light as he'd spoken to the musician about forensic accounting's intricacies, and the hive-like organization of the Northeast RAC, which was only one small part of the service, and the service's history and little understood ideals and sense of mission, and the old joke, to him, about how service employees in social situations would go to such absurd lengths to avoid telling people that they worked for the IRS because it often cast such a social pall because of popular perceptions of the service and its employees, all the while watching the calluses as the woman worked her knife and fork, and that he'd been so nervous and tense that he'd yammered on and on about himself and never asked her sufficiently about herself, her history with the banjo and what it meant to her, which was why she hadn't liked him enough and they hadn't connected. He'd never given the woman with the banjo a chance, he saw now, that what appears to be egoism so often isn't. In some ways, Silvenstein was a whole different person now in systems. Their descent was mainly a heightening of the specificity of what lay below, fields revealed as ploughed and perpendicularly furrowed, and silos as adjoined by canted chutes and belts, and an industrial park as individual buildings with reflexive windows and complicated clumps of cars in the parking lots. Each car not only parked by a different human individual, but conceived, designed, assembled from parts, each one of which was designed and made, transported, sold, financed, purchased, and insured by human individuals, each with life stories and self-concepts that all fit together into a larger pattern of facts. Reynolds' dictum was that reality was a fact pattern, the bulk of which was entropic and random. The trick was homing in on which facts were important. Reynolds was a rifle to Silvenstein's shotgun. The feeling of a slight trickle of blood from his right nostril was a hallucination and to be ignored absolutely. The feeling simply did not exist. Sinus trouble ran in Silvenstein's family in the worst way. Aurelius of ancient Rome. First principles. Exemptions versus deductions. For AGI versus from AGI. A loss sustained from a non-business bad debt is always classified as a short-term capital loss and may therefore be deducted on Schedule D as per the following IRC section. One building's roof had what was either a marked helipad or a complicated visual signal to the planes descending overhead, and the pitch of the propeller's doubled hum was different, and his right sinus was even now ballooning redly in his skull, and they really were descending. The term was controlled descent, the interstate now rococo with exits and half cloverleafs, and the traffic denser and with something insistent about it, and the claw rose from the steel armrest as there appeared a body of water below, a lake or delta, and Silvenstein felt one of his feet was asleep as he tried to recall the peculiar crossed-arm configuration with which the figures on the card held their seat cushions to their chests in the unlikely event of a water landing, and now they did really and truly yaw, and their speed became more evident in the rate of passage of things below in what had to be an older district of Peoria, qua human city, close-packed blocks of sooty brick, and angled roofs, and a television antenna with a flag attached, and a flash of bourbon-colored river that was not the previous body of water, but might have been connected to it. Nothing like the stately and befrothed stretch of Potomac that obtruded through System's windows on Antietam's hallowed site. Noting that the stewardess in her fold-down seat had her head down and arms about her own legs, where, at year's end, the aggregate fair value of Brown's saleable securities exceeds the aggregate carrying amount at the beginning of the year, as out of nowhere appeared an expanse of pale cement rising to meet them with no warning bell or announcement, and his soda can wedged in the seat pocket as the grey death's head beside whipped right and left, and the propeller's shimmering sound shifted either pitch or timbre, and the older lady, stiffening in her seat and raising her pleated chin in fear, and repeating what sounded to Silvenstein like the word chump, as Vane stood bluely in the fist before her, in which was enclosed the crushed and bulbous, but still unopened foil pack of off-brand nuts. The fifth effect has more to do with you, how you're perceived. It's powerful, although its use is more restricted. Pay attention, boy. The next suitable person you're in light conversation with, you stop suddenly in the middle of the conversation and look at the person closely and say, "What's wrong?" You say it in a concerned way. He'll say, "What do you mean?" You say, "Something's wrong, I can tell. What is it?" And he'll look stunned and say, "How do you know?" He didn't realize something's always wrong with everybody, often more than one thing. He doesn't know everybody's always going around all the time with something wrong and believing they're exerting great willpower and control to keep other people, for whom they think nothing's ever wrong, from seeing it. This is the way of people. Suddenly ask what's wrong, and whether they open up and spill their guts or deny it and pretend you're off, they'll think you're perceptive and understanding. They'll either be grateful or they'll be frightened and avoid you from then on. Both reactions have their uses, as we'll get to. You can play it either way. This works over 90% of the time. And stood, having squeezed by the powdery older lady, she being the type that waits in her seat until all others have deplaned and then exits alone with a counterfeit dignity, holding his effects in an aisle whose crammed front portion was all regional business travellers, men of business, willfully homely Midwestern men on downstate sale calls or returning from the Chicago HQs of companies whose names end with Co. Men for whom landings like this, yaw-wobbled horror just past, are business as usual. Paunched and blotchy men in double-knit brown suits and tan suits with attaché cases ordered from in-flight catalogues, men whose soft faces fit their jobs like sausage in its meaty casing. Men who instruct pocket recorders to take a memo, men who look at their watches out of reflex, men with red foreheads all mashed standing in a metal chute as the prop's hum descends the tonal scale and ventilation ceases. This the type of commuter airplane whose stairs must be rolled up alongside before the door opens, for legal reasons. The glazed impatience of businessmen standing closer to strangers than they would ever choose to, chests and backs nearly touching, suit bags slung over shoulders, briefcases knocking together, more scalp than hair, breathing one another's smells. Men who cannot bear to wait or stand still, forced to stand still altogether and wait. Men with calfskin daytimers and Franklin Quest time management certificates, and the classic look of unwilled tight confinement, the look of a local merchant on the verge of an SSI withholding lapse, undercapitalized, illiquid, trying to cover the monthly nut, fish thrashing in the nets of their own obligations. 2 eventual suicides on this plane, 1 forever classed as an accident. In Philly, there had been a whole subgroup of implacable, metal-minded GS9s tasked to nothing but going after small businesses who'd fallen behind on SSI withholding, although in Rome, for almost a year, the only compliance staff taking SSI alerts from Martinsburg had been Eloise Prout, a.k.a. Dr. Yes, a 40-ish GS9 in a macrame hat who ate lunch at her desk out of a complex system of Tupperware containers and was a dinner whore of the most pathetic sort. The boys in examinations, christening her Dr. Yes after she'd reportedly slept with Sherman Garnett on nothing but the promise, not honoured, of a walk around the town commons with the snow stopped and everything crisp and white. The Eloise Prout, who came in so low every month on referral and recovery quotas that any other GS9 would have worn the brown helmet, but dim, kindly REC Mr. Orkney had kept her on. Prout apparently a car crash widow with a GS9 salary that barely bought cat food. Silvenstein was well aware, his foot pulsing with new blood and excusing himself each time someone bumped his carry-on. His third post in 4 years, and still a GS9 with a promise of 11 if he passed the CPA exam this spring, and acquitted himself well in this post as systems eyes on the ground through the March 15 corporate and then April 15 storms of 1040s and ESTs for Peoria 047 to examine, having sat for the exam twice so far, and so far passing only managerial with a low pass, Silvenstein's rep in Philly following him to Rome and locking him firmly into level 1 returns, not even FATS or review, which had made him little more than a professional letter opener, which Sohn, Madrid, et al. Had not been shy about observing. Silvenstein tended to do his desk work in a kind of frenzy, as opposed to the slow, austere, methodical disposition of truly great accountants. His first group supervisor in Rome had told him, a lifetime third shifter who wore an eccentric coat and always left the RAC carrying a little rhomboid carton of delivered Chinese for his wife, who was said to be some kind of shut-in. This GS11 had, early in his career, been posted at the St. Louis Service Center, literally in the shadow of the strange, scary, giant metal arch thing to which mail came daily in great wheezing 18-wheel trailer rigs backing up to the dock's long conveyor, and on breaks in the break room the group leader had liked to lean back, holding his umbrella, and blow silvery clouds of cigar smoke up at the fluorescent lights and reminisce about summer in the Midwest, of which region Silvenstein and the other young Eastern GS9s were ignorant, and in whom the group leader somehow planted visions of fishing barefoot on the banks of motionless rivers and a moon you could read the paper by, and everyone always saying hi to everyone else every time they saw them, and moving in a kind of cheery slow-mo. Named Bussy, Mr. Vince, or Vincent Bussy, who wore a Kmart parka with a hood with a fake fur fringe and could walk chopsticks over his knuckles like a magician with a shiny coin, and disappeared, following Silvenstein's second RAC Christmas party, when his wife, i.e. Mrs. Bussy, had suddenly appeared in the midst of the revel in an off-white nightie and identical unzipped Kmart parka, and approached the assistant regional commissioner for examinations and, speaking slowly and atonally and with total conviction, told him that her husband, Mr. Bussy, had said that he, the ARCE, had the potential to be a really, truly evil person if he grew a somewhat large set of balls. Bussy, 1 week thereafter, gone so abruptly that his umbrella remained hanging from the pod's communal coat rack for almost a quarter until someone finally took it down. They deplaned and descended and collected the carry-on bags that had been confiscated and tagged at Midway, and now rested in a motley row on the wet tarmac beside the airplane, and stood then briefly en masse on a complexly painted cement expanse while someone with orange earmuffs and clipboard counted them, and then cross-checked the count with a previous count undertaken at Midway. The whole operation seemed somewhat ad hoc and slapdash. On the steep and portable staircase, Silvenstein had derived the usual satisfaction from putting his hat on his head and adjusting its angle all with one hand. His right ear popped and cracked slightly with each swallow. The wind was warm and steamy. A large hose extended from a small truck to the commuter plane's stomach and appeared to be refueling the craft for its turnaround to Chicago, up and back again and again all day. There was a strong smell of fuel and wet cement. The older lady, evidently uncounted, now descended the frightening stairs and went to some type of long automobile that Silvenstein had not noticed parked off the airplane's starboard side. A wing obtruded, but Silvenstein could see that she did not open her own door. A distant tree line's tops bent left in the wind and came straight again. Because of previous problems with accidents traceable to poor snap decisions in Philly, Silvenstein no longer drove. He was over 75% certain that the packet of nuts was now inside the older lady's handbag. There was some type of consultation between the employee with the clipboard and another person with orange earmuffs. Several of the other passengers were making pointed gestures of looking at their watches. The air was warm and close, and well beyond humid or muggy. They were all becoming damp on the sides of themselves that faced the wind. Silvenstein now noticed that the dark topcoats many of the businessmen wore were quite similar, as were the flares of the upturned collars. No one else wore any type of hat. He was trying to pay close attention to his surroundings as a way to avert thought and anxiety. The administrative or logistical delay was occurring under a baggy sky, and a rain so fine it seemed to come sideways with the wind instead of fall. There was no sound of rain on Silvenshine's hat. The fur of Mr. Bussey's hood fringe had been dirty in a sort of queasy way that got worse over the 2 years he served as Silvenshine's group supervisor in returns processing. Some of the more assertive passengers were walking unguided down the red line path that led through the fence's gate and toward the terminal. Silvenshine, who had checked bags, was concerned about sanctions for unauthorized departure from the tarmac. On the other hand, he had an assigned schedule to keep. Part of what kept him standing in the restive group of men awaiting authorization to enter the airport was a kind of paralysis that resulted from Silvenshine's reflecting on the logistics of getting to the Peoria 047 RAC. The issue of whether the RAC sent a van for transfers, or whether Silvenshine would have to take a cab from the little airport, had not been conclusively resolved. And then how to arrive and check in and where to store his 3 bags while he checked in and filled out his arrival and postcode payroll and withholding forms and orientational materials, then somehow get directions and proceed to the apartment that Systems had rented for him at government rates, and get there in time to find some place to eat that was either in walking distance or would require getting another cab, except the telephone in the alleged apartment wasn't connected yet, and he considered the prospects of being able to hail a cab from outside an apartment complex were at best iffy, and if he told the original cab he'd taken to the apartment to wait for him, there would be difficulties, because how exactly would he reassure the cabbie that he really was coming right back out after dropping his bags, and doing a quick spot check of the apartment's condition and suitability instead of it being a ruse designed to defraud the driver of his fare? Silvenshine ducking out the back of the Angelus Cove apartment complex, or even conceivably barricading himself in the apartment and not responding to the driver's knock, or his ring if the apartment had a doorbell, which his and Reynolds' current apartment in Martinsburg most assuredly did not, or the driver's queries, threats through the apartment door, a scam that resided in Claude Silvenshine's awareness only because a number of independent Philadelphia commercial carriage operators had proposed heavy Schedule C losses under the proviso losses through theft of service, and detailed this type of scam as prevalent on the poorly typed or sometimes even handwritten attachments required to explain unusual or specific C deductions like this. Whereas, were Silvenshine to pay the fare and the tip, and perhaps even a certain amount in advance on account so as to help assure the driver of his honourable intentions, re the second leg of the sojourn, there was no tangible guarantee that the average taxi driver, a cynical and ethically marginal species, hustlers, as even their smudged returns, very low tip income versus number of fares and an average shift ratios in Philly had indicated, wouldn't simply speed away with Silvenshine's money, creating enormous hassles in terms of filling out the internal forms for getting a percentage of his travel per diem reimbursed, and also leaving Silvenshine alone. Famished, he was unable to eat before travel. Phoneless, devoid of Reynolds' counsel and logistical savvy in the sterile, new, unfurnished apartment. His stomach roiling in on itself in such a way that it would be all Silvenshine could do to unpack in any kind of half-organized fashion, and get to sleep on the nylon travel pallet on the unfinished floor in the possible presence of exotic Midwest bugs, to say nothing of putting in the hour of CPA exam review he'd promised himself this morning when he'd overslept slightly and then encountered last-minute packing problems that had cancelled out the firmly scheduled hour of morning CPA review before one of the unmarked systems vans arrived to take him and his bags out through Harper's Ferry and Ball's Bluff to the airport, to say even less about any kind of systematic organization and mastery of the voluminous post-duty personnel and systems protocols materials that he should be receiving promptly after check-in and forms processing at the post, which any reasonable personnel director would expect a new examiner to have thoroughly internalized before reporting for the first actual day interacting with RAC examiners, and which there was no way in any real world that Silvenshine could expect himself to try to review and internalize on either a 16-hour fast or after a night on the pallet with his damp raincoat as a pillow. He had been unable to pack the special contoured orthotic pillow for his next chronic pinched or inflamed nerve. It would have required its own suitcase, and thereby exceeded the baggage limit and incurred an exorbitant surcharge which Reynolds refused to let Silvenshine pay out of simple principle, with the additional problem of securing any sort of substantive breakfast or return ride to the RAC in the morning without a phone, or how without a phone one was supposed even to verify whether and when the apartment phone was going to be activated, plus of course the ominous probability of oversleeping the next morning due to both travel fatigue and his not having packed his traveller's alarm clock, or at any rate not having been certain that he'd packed it instead of allowing it to go into one of the 3 large cartons that he had packed and labelled, but done a hasty slipshod job of writing out contents lists for the boxes to refer to when unpacking them in Peoria, and which Reynolds had pledged to insert into the service's support branch shipping mechanism at roughly the same time Silvenshine's flight was scheduled to depart from Dulles, which meant 2 or possibly even 3 days before the cartons with all the essentials Silvenshine had not been able to fit in his bags arrived, and even then they would arrive at the RAC, and it was as yet unclear how Claude would then get them home to the apartment. The realization about the traveller's alarm having been the chief cause of Silvenshine's having to unlock and open all the carefully packed luggage that morning on arising, already half an hour late, to try to locate or verify the inclusion of the portable alarm, which he had failed to do. The whole thing presenting such a cyclone of logistical problems and complexities that Silvenshine was forced to do some thought-stopping right there on the wet tarmac, surrounded by restive breathers, turning 360 degrees several times and trying to merge his own awareness with the panoramic vista, which, except for airport-related items, was uniformly featureless and old coin grey, and so remarkably flat that it was as if the earth here had been stamped on with some cosmic boot, visibility in all directions limited only by the horizon, which was the same general colour and texture as the sky, and created the specular impression of being in the centre of some huge and stagnant body of water, an oceanic impression so literally obliterating that Silvenshine was cast or propelled back in on himself, and felt again the edge of the shadow of the wing of total terror and disqualification pass over him, the knowledge of his being surely and direly ill-suited for whatever lay ahead, and of its being only a matter of time before this fact emerged, and was made manifest to all those present in the moment that Silvenshine finally, and forever, lost it.